Thank you to the ACLU of Texas and to the Freedom of Information Foundation of Texas for having us today and for organizing this event. We will have plenty to talk about today, as mentioned. We'll try to catch your questions in the Zoom chat as we go. I want to now turn our attention to our two panelists, which hopefully will be three before we're done, diving into the police transparency issue. The person who's missing, he may be tied up right now because I hear that the House of Representatives has a lot of stuff on their agenda today. Joe Moody is a member of the Texas House representing District 78 in El Paso. He is also an attorney and a former prosecutor. This session, he is the vice chair of the Calendars Committee and also serves on the Chamber's Judiciary and Civil Jurisprudence Committees and the Redistricting Committee, along with his appointment as House Speaker Pro Tem for the second session in a row. Eva Ruth Moravec is the executive director and co-founder of the Texas Justice Initiative, a nonprofit organization that collects, analyzes, and publishes and provides oversight for criminal justice data throughout Texas. She has also covered criminal justice in Texas as a reporter for more than a decade, including stints as a freelancer and at the San Antonio Express News and the Associated Press. Kathy Mitchell is an organizer, a writer, and a grassroots lobbyist with more than 20 years experience promoting criminal justice reform at the Texas legislature. She is also a policy coordinator for the nonprofit Just Liberty, an organization dedicated to comprehensive criminal justice reform in Texas, from traffic stops to the local county jail, the courtroom, prisons, parole, and the reentry process. Now, before we get to questions, I want to hear from each of you about where we are with this issue, and feel free, any of you, to jump in if you have something respectfully you want to add to your fellow panelists and what they're saying. All right, I had planned on starting with Representative Moody, but we will come back to him hopefully when he arrives. So Kathy, let's move on to you. I want to talk about body and dash cameras. This past year, with nationwide protests over police brutality and racial injustice, we've seen even more how crucial this evidence can be and why timeliness really matters. But there is a balance between police and the public, and some have suggested going as far as inserting the judicial system into the mix to help make disclosure decisions about that video. What is currently happening in Texas when it comes to police video and transparency, and where did you and your group hope that it will go this session?
Yeah, so body camera video is largely not transparent. So let's start with that. The body camera law does not prohibit disclosure, but it allows agencies to not disclose. There is language in there that basically authorizes disclosure for a law enforcement purpose. It has always been our position that transparency and public trust in public safety is a law enforcement purpose, that you cannot have a law enforcement agency if you are not trying to build trust with the public, and transparency is fundamental to that. In that vein, over the past about, let's say, 8 months ago, the city of Austin released a local body camera transparency rule that authorizes release of video in critical incidents. They are the first ones to do so. After having run a test run on that policy, to my knowledge, it has not actually been implemented in subsequent critical incidents. There's lots of reasons why we need to have clarity around release. It cannot be the case that police departments get to decide when and how and what parts of video are released. Even if police departments on an individual basis occasionally release body camera video that demonstrates that something went sideways, the public does not believe that they're seeing a true story unless it's released routinely and under standards that would eliminate the ability to release when it makes you look good. Like that's at the bottom line. What people are concerned about is that often body camera is released when it demonstrates that a person was armed, or it demonstrates that there was a reason for that, particular incident playing out the way it did. But meanwhile, in a majority of instances, there is no body camera released, and that simply raises the question, well, what happened? And you don't get an answer. So there will be legislation to address body camera release policy this session. It has not been filed yet to my knowledge, but we fully expect some members to take this up.
Eva Ruth, is there anything you'd like to add on this topic?
I think it's something that people don't really know very much about, don't really expect. We think that, if we have a body-worn camera law in Texas, it just seems intuitive that the footage collected under that law would be something that the public is able to see. And I think it would be surprising for a lot of people to actually understand what this law states and, how lenient it can be if this footage, shows anything that the department doesn't want to get out, they can very much make that happen. And I would like to see agencies use that to promote transparency. Like, it would be great if we could see an agency release footage that doesn't show officers doing the right thing necessarily, just to back that up and maybe change that expectation. But it seems like a law might need to, or legislation might need to be the way to make that change.
And I think that's something that Representative Moody can certainly address as well when we talk about some more transparency legislation a little bit later. Eva Ruth, since we're talking with you, your group keeps up with what's available when it comes to important records like use of force or when someone dies in the custody of law enforcement, which is an issue that my outlet KXAN has actually investigated, finding hundreds of incomplete or late reports in recent years, the subject of pending legislation that I understand Representative Eddie Rodriguez has now been working on. Tell us what's available in Texas when it comes to these types of reports, and how can better access to these reports help?
Well, at this very moment, not a lot is available because, as several people have noted, the Attorney General's websites that collect all of the reports on custodial deaths and on officer-involved shootings are currently not working. So there are no reports in there right now. And that is something that they are aware of, and that IT has been working on now since Monday, I've been told. It had something to do with Salesforce. So to me, that just kind of backs up what we do, in that we built our own system to collect this data and to house it, so that, when Salesforce is having an issue, we can still go on our website and look at these numbers. And I'm lucky that TJI, the Texas Justice Initiative, has been able to get some really amazing volunteers over the years that we've been working on this, and really smart people who are interested in open government and transparency. And so yeah, currently in Texas, we actually do have fairly good, strong laws when it comes to requiring certain things in criminal justice reporting. And if, some people on this call might cover the legislature or be familiar with laws, and very often in the fine print of a law, there is some kind of data collection requirement, or, hey, let's study this, at some point, et cetera. So I think that we have those requirements for officer-involved shootings and deaths in custody. And the Texas Justice Initiative gathers the data from those reports and makes it available to the public on our website. Thanks to these laws that are consistent across the state. Agencies, agency by agency across the state, there's a lot of variety in what data might be collected around use of force. And shootings as well as deaths in custody. So we work at the state level to have some consistency in being able to compare, per capita, maybe one department to another, or just look at trends over time and identify different things, characteristics that might be important to look at.
And I just want to interrupt real quick and introduce and welcome Representative Joe Moody. Thank you for being with us, sir. I know you've got a busy day at the Capitol right now.
Thank you for inviting me, and I apologize for my tardiness. Technology snagged me, and
We've
so
all been there.
I figure after a year of doing these Zoom things, I will figured it out, but apparently still have some learning to do. But apologies that it certainly didn't want to disrupt the schedule. But thank you again for doing this.
Thank you for being here. And I do want to come back to what Eva Ruth was discussing, but if we could turn our attention to you for just a little bit, because I think that some of the topics that you have been dealing with the legislative side of things are things that will kind of encompass all of our conversation today. One of the problems we've been investigating at KXAN for the past few years is the state's dead suspect loophole, which stems from a privacy exception to the Public Information Act, which basically says when a person is arrested but never goes through the court process, a police agency has discretion whether to release information in their case to the public. In cases where that person has died in police custody, they'll never have a chance to go through the court process, so police can essentially keep details in their case secret forever, hence the loophole. You've carried legislation in the past 2 sessions, Representative, to close that loophole, which we discovered has been used a lot across the state in recent years by police, but the bill has not made it to the governor's desk so far and has met quite a bit of opposition from police unions. This session, I understand you're carrying a larger police transparency bill currently in draft that will once again address the dead suspect loophole, or in custody death loophole, as some people know it as. But I hear the bill may also address records related to police personnel files and also the timeline of releasing video of critical incidents. Can you talk about the bill and why it's being put together so encompassing this session?
Sure, and I think obviously, folks that care about these issues probably know some of the background here, but the Public Information Act is and should be driven by the public, right? Our default setting is that we want more information. The government is something that we cede authority to, and the default setting for the government shouldn't be to restrict our access to that information. But unfortunately, that has happened in certain circumstances over time. And when we carve out an exception to the Public Information Act, it is meant to serve a compelling interest. And so let's talk about specifically dead suspect loophole, and then we'll go into the broader bill. So you have two exceptions that make sense on their own, right? You have the general law enforcement exception. Right, you have an ongoing investigation. You certainly don't want to disrupt that. Now, the bill that we'll be filing does make sure that it's clear what information doesn't fall under that exception. So we have basic information to be released to the public about those. But there is a compelling government interest to keep some of that stuff from the public eye as the investigation is ongoing, so as not to jeopardize the investigation. But on the back end of that, you have, okay, someone didn't get convicted or placed on deferred adjudication. So we don't want, that shouldn't be out in the public sphere. Now, the point of that was to protect people that have been wrongfully accused from being dragged through the mud. It wasn't meant to protect bad actors. But when you combine those two and someone dies in custody, the front end can be grabbed by the law enforcement exception, and the back end, because the person will never be convicted, they're never going to be placed on deferred adjudication because they're deceased. That information now can be secreted forever, and that's not the intent of the legislature. And so it is shocking to me that the level of opposition to clarifying a law that is being used as it was never intended to be used. And so, look, none of these are easy topics. When you're talking about someone dying in custody, there's a lot of complicating factors that go into that, but it's why we should shine a light on it. It's why we should understand it. And it's why there should be some accountability. And if there's a tool that's being misused, like this one is, then we need to stop that, so that the public has line of sight. And if you look at the preamble to the Public Information Act, it's very clear. Government doesn't get to choose what is good for us to know and what is not good for us to know. Some of these stories are ugly, and they are disturbing. But unfortunately, those are actually the cases we need to know more about, so that we can get our arms around that. The broader bill we're going to look at, and I know you touched on earlier, is body cam, creating accessibility to body cam footage. If you have this footage, but you're not, I think Kathy maybe touched on that. If you have it, but then we have no ability to access it, then is it really doing, are we just creating window dressing? And so let's be mindful of that. The other is, if you've got sustained, if you got a sustained issue for an officer and they attempt to secret that away in the personnel file, then we need to make sure that those are not things that can be shielded from public view. And these shouldn't be controversial items. These are allowing us to understand a very important interaction. We cede an enormous amount of authority to law enforcement. And if we're going to make sure that we as a public continue to control the government that we created and allow to exist, then we need to have the information. We need to know the good, bad, and the ugly, so that we can react accordingly. And so I've never understood the opposition to it. It can only be that you want to protect bad actors, and I can't imagine that most people would want to say that out loud. So they usually try to scuttle efforts like this behind the scenes. And so it was quite a wide-ranging conversation about this last session, and we're gonna dive deeper into this session, because we need accountability, we need transparency.
So we talked a little bit about body camera before you were with us, and I just wonder also, Kathy or Eva Ruth, do you have any thoughts on what the representative has talked about when it comes to possibly opening up a bit more access to those personnel records?
Absolutely. I mean, as the chairman knows, in any jurisdiction that is under Chapter 143, there's something called the 143-089G file. And the language around what constitutes an 089G file document is overly broad and potentially all-inclusive. It has been a barrier that we can't overcome in most of our major cities. Not all of our cities are civil service Chapter 143 cities, but for those that are, it is a very high bar to get access to anything about misconduct other than, and this is what is allowed to be released, a single document summarizing a violation that resulted in a suspension. Often that document contains no information whatsoever about what factually occurred. So, you know that a person was suspended for a thing, basically. And, given that many officers remain on the force after misconduct or return to the force after misconduct, this again simply results in the public not trusting any of the systems that are in place to ensure that the people who are coming to their homes in emergencies can be trusted. And that's not good for law enforcement, and it's not good for the rest of us.
Eva Ruth, what are your thoughts?
I would just add that, exactly what Kathy was describing, that some city, the inconsistencies between what you can see in one jurisdiction compared to another. This is kind of the same thing that I was talking about with use of force. There's all these different layers of requirements depending on, kind of the mentality of the police chief or the sheriff who's implementing these policies. If they're a data-minded person, they'll have data-minded policies and they'll be collecting this stuff and looking at it on their own. you know, if they are interested in what's underneath their hood and really understanding who makes up their department, then, you know, that's information that these departments have. But then, you know, I think one thing that I've heard being considered now that TCOL is under sunset this session and coming up for, there could be some changes as to how they operate. I think like there could be some opportunities to kind of supersede those levels of inconsistencies by just requiring more statewide, you know, consistencies of our discipline, of our disciplinary records by office, you know, of officers. There's some talk about like TCOL having more responsibilities, more information, so that they are able to disclose, you know, why an officer might have gotten fired from a department or something. So I think that it can be frustrating looking at the differences in criminal justice and how things operate on a local level, you know, among our 254 counties. But I feel like the more consistency we can build on the state level, the better, because then we can actually compare and, you know, have all these other good practices, transparency, and yeah.
Representative, I know that last session, the bill that you introduced ended up as an amendment to another transparency related item, but in the end, you know, CLEAT was one of the big opponents of the measure. CLEAT is the, you know, one of the largest police unions in a state. They were concerned specifically about records about alleged misconduct being released. That wasn't even really the intent of the dead suspect loophole measure, but it was behind the reason it was killed. You called it a deliberate disinformation campaign by CLEAT. Have you started working early with groups like CLEAT to work out some of these discrepancies, knowing that that's probably going to come back up again?
I'm happy to work with anyone that wants to be an honest broker in this conversation. I've always had an open door and tried to rectify these issues last session, but quite honestly, I don't think, at least, and I'm not saying the rank and file membership of that organization, you know, they've got, they just have people that are dishonest in this process, and it's unfortunate because it's a group that, you know, I worked with on making sure that if you're injured in the line of duty, that you're not being fired before you have the chance to properly heal. You know, I care very much about folks that are putting their lives on the line in law enforcement. And I've gone about for those rank and file officers session after session after session. And so very disappointed that when we were trying to get to the bottom of something that was important in terms of some transparency efforts, that we were met with that type of dishonesty. I mean, maybe I'm being a little too naive about it, but I like to sit at the table with folks and try to hash through things, because that wasn't the intent. Well, the intent wasn't to try and get into those files. And in fact, we rewrote the bill utilizing an attorney general's opinion from back when Governor Abbott was the attorney general to address the very issue that they raised. In fact, we worked with the attorney general's office, and because guess who makes determinations about the Public Information Act? The attorney general's office. So we went directly to them and they said, does this amendment satisfy the concern we're hearing from this law enforcement group? And they said, yes, that is the entity that's going to be making the decision. And they told us, yes, this solves the problem. And still that wasn't good enough. That just tells me someone's not being honest. And so if you ask me to solve a problem and we don't want to get after those types of files, we can do that. We can do that. And we did do it. The bill did that. And so we addressed every single one of their concerns. And instead they just turned and told us all that we hated cops and we wanted to see more dead cops on the street. That's essentially what they turned to. They just kind of burned everybody to the ground, refused to meet with the chair of criminal jurisprudence, refused to meet with the chair of county affairs, refused to meet with the chair of higher ed. I mean, refused to meet with multiple high-ranking legislators that were working and cared about these issues. And that's not the way you solve problems. The table's always open. I'll continue to have it open, but the people sitting there, I would ask to be honest brokers. And you know, I think that you gotta learn those lessons as you move through the legislature. Some people are gonna shoot you straight and some people aren't.
Generally, what is the climate like for transparency right now in the legislature among you and your colleagues? I know Speaker Phelan was the chair of State Affairs last session when you were working on that bill, and he was supportive of the measure. Does having someone like that in charge of the chamber, and you, of course, being Speaker Pro Tem, does that help the efforts for transparency in Texas?
Doesn't hurt. That's the short answer. I mean, every session's different. The dynamic, the ebb and flow, and we've already seen what happened last week in Texas has completely shifted the way the session's going to look. And so the bandwidth to take up matters is narrowing quickly. We haven't had bills referred yet to committee, so it's going to be challenging. So yes, it is good to have people that care about these issues in positions of authority, but yeah, we're going to be, we're already behind. We were going to be behind in the, being the pandemic situation. Everything was going to be slower, more methodical anyway. And so now we have an added layer of complexity to the session because an entirely new issue that wasn't on the table is now going to absorb, and deservedly so, absorb a significant amount of time. And so it's challenging. There are a lot of good members that care deeply about this issue, and so I tend to think that we got a better shot than most. But it's not lost on me how difficult session is going to be in terms of timing.
Our friend Bill Elshire, he has a question, rather a comment about police investigations and information sometimes being withheld under the Public Information Act's litigation exception. He says, for example, if a city gets sued or even just threatened to be sued over a police shooting, all of the information related to that litigation can be withheld under the litigation exception. He suggests that the entire litigation exception should be repealed. One question is, should the litigation loophole in the Public Information Act, what should happen with that? Eva Ruth, this is something I know you pay a lot of attention to with officer-involved shootings and custodial deaths. Do you want to start?
I mean, I'm not a lawyer, so I know that there are a lot of considerations to, that the issues that could come up with, releasing stuff when something could still be litigated. I guess all I would really be comfortable saying about it, I think Moody would probably be better equipped on this one, but I would say, this is why, I really appreciate things like the custodial death reporting requirement, the officer involved shooting requirement, and other fine print in state laws that require these reports that, are releasable no matter what, even when something is still, like when the case file is still being held up and you can't get to that. There is still a base level of information that you can get or that you should be able to access if they are filed appropriately. But yeah, I would pass the torch on this one.
Torch passed. Go for it, Representative.
Me pretending to answer a question from an expert like Bill Elshire is a little daunting. As someone who has done thousands and thousands more hours of work on this topic than I have, and I appreciate a lot of the commentary that he's offered up, and have read much of it and watched some of the litigation that he's been involved in. So I'll say this: it's not been something that we have touched on in our work in the last 2 or 3 sessions, but would definitely open the door to having that conversation. And so look forward to connecting with you, Mr. Elshire. If you want to, we can connect and talk through that, because I would need the expertise that you have to offer to the conversation, and always happy to do the work and dive into it. But I think like I said, I think the base level where we should start from in the Public Information Act is disclosure, right? That's the default setting. So let's start there and figure out how we can improve the system of exceptions that we've put in place.
Earlier you alluded to all of the other issues that are very pressing in the state right now. Some of those overlap with public information and transparency, even when it comes to law enforcement. I know this is an issue, Eva Ruth, that you have been looking into a lot. Specifically, you and I have talked about PR bonds and how they are being part of this conversation when it comes to the coronavirus maybe, and how people are treated in jail, and how those open records come out. Can you explain to our audience kind of what's going on there?
Yes, it's quite inside baseball, but I am happy to share my knowledge on this. So one of the agencies under sunset review in the interim was the Texas Commission on Jail Standards, which is tasked with, providing oversight of jails throughout the state. And so one of the things that actually came up in their self-reported or self-evaluation, the executive director's self-evaluation, wrote about an issue of jails basically releasing people on their deathbeds on PR bonds, on personal recognizance bonds. Some people, there were stories of people couldn't even really sign their names. They were being released to essentially die outside of law enforcement custody, so that the agency did not have to then file a custodial death report as required by state law. So these reports must be filed within 30 days. They can be amended afterwards, but in this case, or in these cases, the Brandon Wood from TCJS said that, there's no real way to force these agencies to count these deaths. Through my work at the Texas Justice Initiative, I've come across many instances, I would say dozens, of custodial death reports not being filed at all. There's plenty that aren't filed in a timely manner, and there really isn't much that can be done in those cases. Usually what I do, and anyone else that wants to follow this process, feel free to reach out. I can send you my language. I'm happy to share this responsibility with anybody. But usually when I come across one that's not reported, I will reach out to the agency. Sometimes I'll file an open records request with the agency just to see if that shakes it out. Sometimes that works. Sometimes the agency says we didn't have to file it because of XYZ. I can also then go to the Attorney General's office and just say, hey, just so you know, this death happened. This is my evidence as to how I know it happened, and it's not reported. The AG can, get involved, but state law does not require them to. And they've oftentimes taken the approach that they're just a repository for this kind of information. So as the custodial death reporting law is currently written, it's a misdemeanor if agencies do not file their reports, but that would have to be a charge that would be brought by the local district attorney, which would not happen, if you can imagine, if you know how these relationships work. So that charge, as you know, Josh, has never been used. And I think there is some interest this year in changing that law to add some teeth so that we can actually compel these agencies to file reports when they're not doing so. So there's one avenue of reporting that has to happen to TCJS, under their standards and everything. So Brandon Wood can, tell these agencies you have to file whatever report they're required. But as far as the Attorney General's report, there's nothing that can really be done to really compel them. So long answer, but that's where I think things might have some potential to move regarding the requirements around custodial deaths and trying to shore up that PR bond issue, and also just the kind of lack of teeth to the law overall.
Kathy, I want to bring you back in now. One of the questions we have is about the trend toward law and order. Would that make passing law enforcement transparency harder this session? I know a lot of people thought, last summer we were having conversations about there's so much focus on what's going on right now with the protests and with racial injustice and police brutality, that might mean some progress for transparency in the current session. What do you think? What's going to happen?
Yeah, I think we are going to have progress. Taking Chairman Moody's point as critically important to understand. The new layer of additional content that the legislature is absorbing after last week has put everything else behind. So setting aside just that practical barrier, I have not seen any unwillingness on the part of any member to talk about reforming officer conduct and reforming the rules of engagement for officers. You know, we can be a law and order state. That doesn't mean that we have unlawfulness and disorder at the front end of our emergency system. When you call 911 in an emergency, regardless of the nature of that emergency, you need to have confidence that the person who is showing up at your door or at the side of the road is going to help you. And, you know, in so many cases, we have seen exactly the opposite occur. And so the conversation is actually happening right now. Members are listening, they're interested. Transparency is a piece of that. And if you don't mind, I want to add one more piece that we haven't talked about, but I kind of had it on my agenda for today. One of the reasons that the conversations locally over misconduct can go sideways between the community expectation and what law enforcement is doing is because in some jurisdictions, the rules of engagement are not public. So by that, I mean, some cities put the general orders, which are the rules by which officers are supposed to behave. That's what they're being held accountable to. Some cities are posting the whole thing online. And some, if you ask under open records for pieces of the general orders, say the force section or the asset forfeiture section or any other choice of section, you know, you will be sent to the Attorney General. And there are a number of Attorney General opinions that allow agencies to keep the rules of engagement. The basic thing that is what we say officers are supposed to be held accountable to is confidential. It can be held confidential under 108 because it might reveal some secret rule that officers use to conduct criminal investigations. That is completely ridiculous. There's no secrets in the general orders. I routinely read general orders from all over the country in order to understand what the rule is in that jurisdiction. So for example, we've had a lot of dialogue in this state about what we do when a suspect is escaping. How much force can we use to stop a person who may be guilty of passing a bad check from running away? What is the appropriate approach to addressing a minor property offense if the offender is leaving the scene? This is actually a rule in every general order, and the public should have access to it in order to have that conversation about what our expectations are and what's reasonable. So if we can't even see the rules of engagement, how can we trust that officers are acting in everyone's best interest? We can't.
That's a good point. We're getting some questions about, you know, specifics about numbers for the legislation, like do we have a bill number yet for the dead suspect loophole so people can keep track of that? I know that legislation can still be filed through part of March, so it's still ongoing right now.
Yeah, we're in draft on those, but as soon as we get them and file them, we'll certainly send around. I will say this is one of those, you have legislative council that you have multiple of them working from home. And so it has been a very real slowdown in simply getting bills drafted, things that have been drafted before, even just swapping out the date of enactment has taken some time. It's been challenging. And so, yeah, anyway, short answer is we're in draft, but as soon as we get them back, we're pushing to get them back as quickly as possible. So, and, you know, being an attorney, my chief of staff being an attorney as well, and serves as my legal counsel, we were able to help push that along a little bit more. So
That's appreciated, I'm sure.
we do our part. But on the changing tone, I want to echo what Kathy said. I reject this idea that because you want accountability and transparency, you somehow you don't support law enforcement, or you are not for law and order, right? I've never seen any good policy come from a catchy phrase or hashtag. And so I just don't like to go down that road, because it's a false narrative. It doesn't allow, it puts people in camps, right? So then you start dividing people, and then, I mean, that's how nothing happens. That's how the status quo happens. When you push people to separate camps and you don't realize that there are some very common issues that you can work on together, then the status quo wins. And right now, the answer that we want is something different than the status quo. So we gotta push that hyper politicized language, and it's against our nature sometimes. You know, in politics, they push you to be in the spotlight and say incendiary things and all. I mean, it's become more prominent in our work in the last several years. But you know, I've been a proponent of trying to make government boring again. Like, let's just this is the work we're supposed to do, where this is not entertainment. This is serious business. If people are dying in custody, that's a serious, but I see that Miss Kathy Dyer is on here and watching, sitting with her and her family and understanding what they went through. You know, I'm not going to give into an argument about catchphrases. This is important. It's important because families like hers have suffered. And it's important because the public deserves to have information. She deserves it as a family member, but the public deserves it because those pieces of government belong to us. That gets lost in this conversation, and we shouldn't let it get lost. And anyway, so is it more difficult? I think the conversation is changed. I think people that aren't willing to dive into it deeply might get stopped before they would dive into it. But just today, we formally brought into existence the Criminal Justice Reform Caucus, which was born out of a lot of frustration at the end of last session. It is a bipartisan caucus. It's equally made up of Republicans and Democrats. It has multiple chairs of several impactful committees on it. And the reason it exists is to be a clearinghouse for things like this. And so let's clear through the noise. Let's sit down and talk to one another and understand what we can get consensus on, because I know that we can do that. And so just today we formed that group. Jeff Leach serves as the co-chair along with myself. So Republican and Democrat, and our vice chairs are Victoria Nyave and James White. And so another Republican and Democrat that care very deeply about these issues. And so that's how we build a successful path this session. Because of the short timeline, you have to be better organized, and you have to be, you've got to clear out some of those roadblocks very quickly. And so when you have a group that's focused on that, it can help you move the legislation.
I'm glad that you pointed out Kathy Dyer. She and her husband, Robert, they have been, crucial to testimony when it comes to the dead suspect loophole and police transparency measures in the last couple of sessions. You mentioned what's so different about this session, obviously having to work from home and everything like that. So it's going to be different for testimony as well, I'm sure. One of the things that Kathy Dyer actually points out is talking about from the family's perspective, we are told the only avenue to getting records is to file a lawsuit. And I know that's what they had to do in their case when their son, Graham, passed away in police custody up in Mesquite. I just remember hearing in the past, law enforcement has said, we don't really have a problem sharing video or whatever with the family. We just don't want to always share it with the public, with the press, that kind of thing. But that's not really the full spirit of transparency, is it?
No, and that was part of kind of the dishonest approach that was taken last session, was saying that the purpose of the bill was specifically to open that door for families who need closure. And all you have to do is go back and look at the presentation. Yes, we do care about Kathy and her family and other families that have suffered through that. And that's important. And that should be a part of the conversation. But this is, I'm going to go back to very basic, the words mean something to me. The Public Information Act is a default setting of disclosure. And these items belong to the public, and the government doesn't get to decide what's good for us to know and what's bad for us to know. Yes, there are families that I think have had exceedingly difficult circumstances, and we should certainly make sure that they're taken care of in this way. But the public broadly deserves access to these things. And so the bill was never narrowly drawn like that. And anyone who says otherwise is not being honest about the effort that we're working on.
One of the things that has surrounded the law enforcement, conversation when it comes to legislation has been the talk about the George Floyd Act that, was brought up as early as last summer. The governor was early on very supportive of it. And, I know that recently when he was talking to Senator Royce West, before his State of the State address, they talked about this and how it should proceed. Would an act like that, would a measure like that looks to reform police, should that include more transparency efforts in it? Would that help some of these transparency items, have a vehicle like that?
I'll speak to that. As part of a coalition of dozens and dozens of groups that have been supporting and backing the George Floyd Act. Yes, of course, transparency helps everywhere. The George Floyd Act was crafted specifically to address some things that happened to George Floyd and to address some things that the family prioritized. So it really leans directly into my sort of previous comment about the rules of engagement. We haven't in this state amended or looked at the duties of police, for example, to my knowledge, since for I don't know how many decades. And currently, we don't have a duty to intervene, and we don't have a duty to render aid. The Attorney General recently opined in response to James White that, in fact, we do not have a duty to intervene under our current law. So there's specific things that are in there that all basically kind of address the things that happened to him at the end of his life, as well as some things that happened to him in Texas earlier in his life. For example, the loophole that's in our requirement related to corroborating evidence in drug cases. That Tulia bill passed 20 years ago with an exception for law enforcement, undercover law enforcement officers, even though the Tulia case was based on that false testimony of an undercover law enforcement officer. And subsequent to the passage of that bill, leaving in that loophole, which Cleat demanded, let's be clear, Gerald Goins became a problem for George Floyd. So George Floyd personally experienced the uncorroborated testimony of an undercover law enforcement officer in a case that he might have, had he ever gotten the notice, gotten overturned. So yes, transparency is always critically important, and there may be a time for that conversation as the bill moves forward, but it was initially passed in order to change the rules of engagement in some ways that are much needed so that behavior can follow.
Eva Ruth, when I talk to journalists in other states, they always, mention that Texas is a lot more transparent with certain things than many other states. So what is Texas doing right when it comes to what is being collected or distributed as far as law enforcement transparency?
Yeah, I think it's back to that fine print, back to this. And I see lawmakers, or I used to see lawmakers when I'd be in the press seats, kind of rolling their eyes when somebody says, we have to study this, or we need to count this, but that really matters. Like, counting things actually matters and allows for like us to identify problems and things like that. So like, while it might not even look like transparency, even in the George Floyd Act conversations, if there are things that we can count, like how often chokeholds are being used, or like different things that can be measured so that we can understand a problem better. I think that's one thing that lawmakers in Texas, like, whether intentionally or not, are pretty good at. When, I thinking back to 2015, that's when I started to, look at this stuff. I was at the legislature covering it, and Eric Johnson from Dallas worked on this bill to pass, an officer-involved shooting reporting requirement. And I still remain, surprised at sort of the ease that bill had in getting passed at a time when these conversations were very, passionate and continue to be very two-sided, unfortunately. And Johnson, really pushed for, we need to count this. We need to know how big this problem is. And there was some opposition, but it went through. And then even in the interim before 2017, I started to look at these officer-involved shooting reports, and I found that there were plenty of fatality shootings that were not being reported under this law because it really had no teeth to it. And brought this to Representative Johnson's attention, and he even in 2017, even in this atmosphere of continued law and order, increasing, was able to tighten up his bill without any opposition that I recall from the police unions, and make it actually like something that could be penalized, that departments could be financially penalized for if they don't follow this law. And the conversation that I remember having with unions at that time in 2017 was, if there's already a law on the books, then we should be following it. So the fact that it wasn't being followed was enough for them to think, well, this could be, it was kind of like this weird space for law enforcement to be in. The law was about them, but they weren't following it. So like, it was an interesting position. But I think back to that, and when I start to feel like I'm getting in this mindset of, law enforcement doesn't want this transparency or is anti this, like, there have been little movements that have, incremental change has been made over time that allow us to be where we are, which is a pretty unique position across the country. California also requires similar custodial death reporting and officer-involved shooting reporting. But our law, I think, actually is better than theirs because it allows for reports to be amended. And these things change over time. Evidence comes out. Body-worn cameras might suddenly appear that nobody thought existed, So I think allowing for the investigation to happen in Texas is really a good thing too.
And I really like that example with Eric Johnson's bill, because that's just a perfect example of how you do one thing and come back, another session down the road and try to make it even better. I mean, you talked about the custodial death reporting laws. That goes all the way back to the early 80s. The measure that put the dead suspect loophole in place goes back to 1997. So sometimes it's just a matter of going back and refining what lawmakers have already done.
I would like to add that, and for the reporters in the room, this is something that nobody's really using right now. the Sandra Bland Act of last session included some very interesting reporting on the front end of the system on traffic stops. And it was sort of stumbled and bumbled, and the Hinkle rules doing it were done wrong, and the first round of reporting was all messed up, to be honest. But they are all coming back now, and I believe in the month of March 1st, with actual fixed appropriate reporting that tells us things that we really need to know, like, for example, the enormity of the volume of Class C arrests at traffic stops. This was a huge issue last session with the bill to end arrests for non-jailable violations. We now have data. So last session, we did not get the Sandra Bland bill again, but we did get reporting. And the reporting is likely to be very interesting and coming soon.
Go ahead, Eva Ruth, yes.
I would just add, that's exactly the kind of thing, like, that's the fine print. And there are other, like the Texas Commission on Jail Standards has fine print that requires certain reporting every month to them. There's a lot of data out there that actually exists, and we're trying at TJI to gather more of it and put it all through our automated systems and build visualization so people can take advantage of that information as well, but just takes time.
Great. We have just a few minutes left for final thoughts. I want to start with you, Representative.
Sure. Thank you, and thanks for everybody participating today. I look forward to the conversation going from here. But man, that last piece is a good way to end, because the legislative session takes lots of twists and turns. I remember 2017, the Sandra Bland bill, and Chairman Coleman working on that diligently. And I remember working with him, and there was some disappointment that the Class C arrest piece came out of that bill. And some of the writing around that said, oh, well, they took everything meaningful out of the bill, and now they're just, the families walked away from the bill, that it doesn't do anything anymore. And I sat and talked to Chairman Coleman. I know he was disappointed that he didn't get everything he wanted in that bill, but he said, you always got, he said, move the ball forward. And he said, the data that we're going to gather off this bill is going to allow us to change the law that we ultimately want to change. He said, never lose sight of the goal. Everything you do should move you closer to your goal. If you didn't get there this session, and he's been here long enough to have had successes and failures, but he knows to always advance, and he did that very, very well in that bill. It's a bill that came through our committee back in 2017, and so I was intimately involved with those conversations. And I was, when he started pointing out to me the finer points in the bill that remained, I said, well, this lays the groundwork for what we do in the future. So keep that in mind as we navigate this session. We may not get everything across the finish line for a number of reasons, maybe just logistics of session, but we need to make sure that we always advance the cause of transparency and allow for more data points to be gathered, or different way for them to be gathered, or hold people accountable if they don't produce them, like Representative Johnson did. So, we need to be creative around this. You can do things in the budget. You can do things through bill. You can do things via amendment. So keep an eye on all those things. And there are multiple ways to be successful this session. So I look forward to being a part of that conversation.
All right, Kathy, real quick, we're almost out of time. Final word?
No, I think that covers it.
Eva Ruth, spotlight on you.
Thanks for having me. Thank the other panelists for your great work. And if the Texas Justice Initiative can ever be a resource, or I personally am happy to answer reporters' questions, researchers' questions anytime. So feel free to reach out.
All right, Eva Ruth, Kathy, Representative, thank you for being part of this conversation. Everyone who watched and sent us questions, thank you. And once again, a big thanks to the ACLU of Texas and the Freedom of Information Foundation of Texas for organizing this event. You can keep up with the progress of police transparency in Texas by going to those organizations' websites throughout the legislative session. I'm Josh Hinkle from KXAN in Austin. And on behalf of this entire group, thank you again. Have a great day.